Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. If you do a Google search for starving polar bears, this is what comes up. What you'll see is a lot of pictures someone took a few years ago of an old, sick, dying bear. And then Google adds this across the top: climate change, global warming, dying, hungry, skinny. The propaganda that Google is creating is that this old, sick bear is dying because people are using fossil fuels. They don't have anything to do with each other, but this is the standard propaganda from the press and social media. Now let's take a look at this week's news from the Netherlands. Hungry polar bears are scuppering expedition to Spitsbergen. A Dutch polar expedition to Spitsbergen to study the effects of climate change is being scuppered by the presence of hungry polar bears. Then it goes on to say, there are more polar bears than expected, the expedition leader told the press. When the sea ice retreats, the bears prefer to stay on the ice, but the rapidly melting process caught them out. So the message is once again that the burning of fossil fuels has made the excessively large population of polar bears at Spitsbergen very hungry. No mention of the fact that while polar bears are not hibernating, they're hungry all the time. They need to build up fat to survive the winter. Now let's travel back in time 100 years and see what was going on in Spitsbergen back then. Monthly Weather Review, November 1922. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sailed the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Formerly, the waters about Spitsbergen held an even summer temperature of about 3 degrees Celsius. This year recorded temperatures up to 15 degrees. And last winter, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. This warming of the Arctic 100 years ago was widely reported by the press. And they published this map showing how the sea ice never made it close to the shores of Spitsbergen during the winter of 1921 through 1922. There was no ice around Spitsbergen during the winter of 1922, but this year there was lots of ice. In other words, there's more ice now in the eastern Arctic than there was 100 years ago. The press also reported in 1922 that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, rotten, moving ice. But this year there's a lot of thick ice between the North Pole and Alaska. So apparently there's more ice in the western Arctic now than there was 100 years ago. In a 1948 scientific paper, Dr. Hans Allman, the leading Arctic authority of the time, reported a tremendous amount of warming had occurred in Spitsbergen over the prior 30 years. And he also reported on a huge amount of glacial retreat which had occurred in Norway. And here's another report from 100 years ago. Except over a small area, it is generally understood the glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. The Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland has retreated 4 miles since 1850, and the East Glacier in Spitsbergen is more than a mile away from its original terminal moraine. We know that 100 years ago Spitsbergen was very warm. There was no sea ice any time during the year, and glaciers were rapidly retreating. Despite the lack of sea ice, the polar bear population survived. And if we go back in time to when Stonehenge was built, there was very little sea ice in the Arctic, and it may have been periodically ice-free. Yet, despite the warm temperatures and lack of sea ice, the polar bear population survived just fine. This propaganda from Google and the Dutch press has no basis in science or reality. And odds are that YouTube will attach some baseless anti-fossil fuel propaganda to this video as well. Supporting this propaganda is worthless data from government agencies like NASA. In 1922, the Arctic was rapidly melting, and NASA shows that year as being one of the coldest on record. This year there's more sea ice in the eastern Arctic than there was 100 years ago, but NASA shows this year as being one of the hottest on record. Ice doesn't lie, but government climate scientists do. If you regularly watch my videos, the warmth of 1922 is no surprise. 1921 brought a global heat wave and drought which threatened millions of people in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia with starvation. But never mind reality, NASA shows 1921 as being one of the coldest years on record. I'm going to finish this up with one more article from 100 years ago. It described the world's greatest problem as being a lack of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They said the shortage of carbon dioxide was severely inhibiting the growth of crops. A German scientist, Dr. Riedel, did some experiments where he greatly increased the amount of carbon dioxide around crops and saw tremendous improvements in yield. From these results, there seems to be no doubt that fertilizing the air with carbon dioxide is a more efficient and cheaper way of increasing the crops than treating the ground with manures. They generated this excess carbon dioxide to improve crop yields by burning coal. The rise in carbon dioxide over the last 60 years has correlated with a tremendous increase in crop yields. In other words, the burning of fossil fuels has been very good for humanity. So I have to wonder, who is paying Google and YouTube to demonize something which has been so beneficial for the human race? Toto realized 14 years ago that the agenda driving global warming propaganda was anti-human, and they cynically present it as being the exact opposite. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.